African American. People might not identify themselves as African anything, even if, right, and that's why it's tough to say, okay, well, this whole group is, because you could argue that people who speak Spanish and are from the West Indies are African American, because their lineage comes from Africa. Sure.
This question is rhetorical. You ready to deal with it?
Sure.
They told me African descent means men with one grown. Anybody that don't have one grown is not African descent. Is that true? You understand what I'm saying? I said the question was rhetorical now.
Okay.
One grown.
What does that mean? One grown?
One intestine, one thing down there.
I never heard that.
Let's move on with that.
Yeah, we can discuss that after, because I'm curious. All right. This is a drawing of one of the jockeys at the Jerome Park Raceway. This was actually used on our press release that went out, and it's one of the images that you're going to see outside on the display that we have. And it just gives you a good sense of there being black jockeys competing against white jockeys, and also you can see the grandstand of the Jerome Park Raceway in the back. That existed where the current location of roughly where Lehman College is in the northwestern part of the Bronx. When the city was incorporated in 1898, subway and trolley lines helped transport workers throughout the borough. The floodgates of immigration opened up, and we began to see massive immigration from Manhattan and beyond. The old breweries, piano factories, iron foundries, and munitions plants began to disappear, and new housing was built. Morris High School, one of the first 3 public high schools in New York City, opened its doors in 1897 as an integrated high school. It was also a beacon of education in a beautifully constructed building. It still stands today. And it has alumni such as Colin Powell. This picture is of the Acorn Literary Society. It was taken in 1905. And the reason why I've used this photo is you see the president of the Acorn Literary Society, we don't know his identity, was a black man. And you see another black woman in the photo, along with the immigrants and Bronxites who were sitting here. And it really gives you a sense that the Bronx was not only integrated, but it was really in the forefront of having integrated schools, whereas other places in the country in 1905, you would never have seen this. And this is a bird's eye view of Kelly Street in South Bronx, where Colin Powell actually lived in this apartment building. During the 20th century, the population of the Bronx grew exponentially. Southern blacks following the train lines moved out of the South, westward, northward, and beyond in what was called the Great Migration. West Indian immigrants began to come in as well, and by the 1950s, areas of the Bronx that were previously German, Irish, Italian, and Jewish were now Jamaican, Trinidadian, Bayesian, and Puerto Rican. Synagogues became churches. Cuisine began to change to reflect the local flavor of the people. The neighborhoods of Morrisania, Mount Haven, and Melrose had many social clubs and jazz clubs. The Bronx produced many great musicians, including Thelonious Monk, Ella Fitzgerald, and later Frankie Lyman. The Yankees in 1955 got their first black player, Elston Howard, number 32, being the second to last franchise to integrate in baseball. The Brooklyn Dodgers, not too far away, were the first. The Bronx had seen a change, and it was generally a peaceful one. We also began to see black politicians, such as Walter Gladd and Ivan Warner and Wendell Foster. This is showing you the rise in population from 1910 to 1940 of blacks. In blue, we have New York City, and down here, we have the Bronx. Even though it looks small in comparison, you see how the population exploded in about 30 years. It is important to know that the Bronx population goes from almost nothing to a significant number, about 23,000 right here by 1940. As the 20th century continued, there were turbulent times in America. The 1960s and the Bronx weren't immune to this. The tenement apartment buildings that were constructed at the beginning of the century to accommodate the population explosion were now beginning to fall into disrepair. Landlord apathy led to buildings becoming unlivable, and eventually fires began to appear. Landlords were able to benefit from federally backed mortgage insurance from the Depression, So if their buildings burned or were destroyed, they could collect the value on their properties. There were stories of landlords paying drug addicts to burn their buildings, and addicts stripping the buildings of its copper pipes to sell to support their habits. During the 1950s, the city began to construct massive housing projects. These projects, built as integrated homes, were designed for working-class families to enable them to save money and move on to more desirable homes. As the first wave of families began to leave, screening policies changed, and by the mid to late 1970s, the housing projects had become dangerous. These are just some slides of the development of the black community here in the Bronx in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. As the first wave of families began to leave, screening policies changed, and like I said, the housing projects became a bit more dangerous. But when the fires started, the housing projects were not but 2 decades old and were much more desirable to families than the old tenement buildings. As the fire continued, city residents who were burned out of their places were allowed to jump to the top of waiting lists for apartments in the projects, and a factor contributed to arson and the urban wasteland that eventually resulted. And this is an example of what numerous blocks look like. I've heard stories from people who said they could travel on the subway and see nothing but rubble for 3 or 4 or 5 subway stops. Again, this is all part of what became known as the Burning Bronx. You see how buildings were left abandoned, boarded up so people couldn't enter them. And this is actually the inside of what one of the tenement apartment buildings would look like. Many people who are here might have grown up in an apartment that looked like this, but you can see after 40, 50 years, floors began to show the wear. You see water damage here, and you can tell that a lot of the circumstances were unlivable for a lot of people. What I've done here is take the population of different community districts, community district 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and what is known as the South Bronx. And you can see how the population numbers dropped dramatically between 1970, 1980, 1990. While the burnouts and the subsequent problems were extremely devastating, a new form of musical expression was actually born out of the ashes. The godfather of hip-hop, Africa Bambaataa, out of the Bronx River Projects, created a grassroots form of expression based around breakdancing, graffiti, DJing, and MCing, which are the 4 elements of hip-hop. Needless to say, we all know this music has become the pop music of my generation. And while it has enjoyed much financial success, many of the pioneers of the industry have gone unnoticed, or their contributions have been ignored. The last 20 years has seen a gradual rebirth of the Bronx. Of the 1.4 million residents who are here, over 500,000 consider themselves black. The area of Morrisania, Mount Haven, and Melrose that was once barren and abandoned during the 70s, 80s, and 80s have seen new construction in the 90s, reinvestment, and have seen people return, as you saw in that last slide. Many different immigrant groups have moved in, including Puerto Ricans, Central Americans, and Spanish-speaking Caribbeans. This has made for a mixture of people that few other places in our country enjoy. Moving forward, there's still much work to be done. Yes, the Bronx boasts the only black district attorney in the state of New York, the Honorable Robert Johnson, a graduate of James Monroe High School. Yes, the Yankees are staying here in the Bronx. But in order to continue to be on the up and up, careful focus and attention must be paid to the students, the future of the borough. While the New York City public school system was once one of the country's best, we must hold ourselves and our communities and our elected officials accountable for what our children are learning and what they're doing in school. We also must continue to build places like this library that we are in today and give children viable options of where to spend their time. It is all about students in the future. Without them, what I say here and what we do here is obsolete. In closing, we at the Bronx County Historical Society are doing some groundbreaking work. We're currently working with Fordham University's African and African American Studies Department, one of the country's best, on a massive research project called the Bronx African American History Project today. That was the brainchild of Dr. Peter Derrick, who's here, and Dr. Mark Nason at Fordham. We're working on numerous publications that highlight the contributions of marginalized groups and moving forward with our school programs and educational outreach. This is truly an exciting time to be part of Bronx history, and I'm glad to have shared this piece of information with you today. I will now open the floor for any questions. Sure.
I'm glad you came, I learned a lot. I'm sorry my last question was so derogatory, but I excuse myself.
It's all right.
And come back again.
Oh, thank you. Yes, sir.
This pertains to the slaves being brought from Africa. Like it is widely said that a lot of the slaves that were brought here were brought as a result of being sold to the Europeans by other Africans. I don't want you to spread some light on that.
Yeah, well, the institution of slavery was not new in 1444. It was practiced throughout the Arab world and practiced throughout antiquity. The difference in the slavery of the 15th and 16th and 17th century was that it turned and took a different form of what became known as chattel slavery, where slaves were not actually able to become part of societies. They were marginalized, not counted even as people. Other forms of slavery, whether in Greece or in Egypt, oftentimes a slave would be able to become a citizen. Whereas the chattel slavery that existed here in the United States was extremely difficult for people to fully integrate into society. Not to say that slavery didn't have a negative impact elsewhere, but it was extremely difficult here.
You sort of didn't answer my question, if you don't mind. Like I was referring to, it said that slaves were not captured on the mainland of Africa and brought here. A lot of them were brought here as a result of being sold by fellow Africans.
Right.
And brought here. So I just want to know, do you have any idea of the percentage breakdown of that? Every slave that was brought here was sold by an African?
That I don't know. But what I do know is that of the slaves brought from Africa, only 7% of those slaves actually came to North America. The rest went to the West Indies, Mexico, and South America.
I wanted to ask about the African burial ground, because were a lot of the Bronx slaves that were here in the Bronx, were they buried in the African burial ground, which is down by Wall Street, or did they have a burial spot up here in the Bronx that they actually had them buried?
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know that answer. We're still trying to uncover information about that. Huh?
Well, you mentioned the one in Unionport, and also the one over by Hunts Point. There were not far from Drake's Park was an African burial ground there also. There were a few, but they were mostly, and also in Van Cortlandt, there's still some headstones up there.
Sure.
I know you said that the last part of the picture of our court where it said that the Bronx is starting to increase and we're starting to get better things like the projects and everything. What about the people coming from Africa that's working for less than minimum wage? How does it make you educated people that went to school feel better? Does it?
I don't know. I don't know.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I have a question. My family is working at Birth Sanctuary, just got Birth Sanctuary. It's in the Bronx, on Grant Avenue. And we're trying to do some research because it's on Grant Avenue, and I was able to find, when you mentioned a racetrack, I was able to find at one point that was possibly a racetrack, but I need to know how I can find that information. Do you have any?
Okay. Yes, see me afterwards. We can set you up with our research librarian.
Cool, thank you.
The lecture was really good. I
Thank
learned a lot. You mentioned that the Moors invaded Africa?
No, they invaded the Iberian Peninsula.
Okay, because the Moors weren't there a combination of African and Arab?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The idea of indentured servants, I had heard that before, but I never put it together till you mentioned it. But how dramatically different is that from being a slave?
Yeah, well, from the research I did, the 17th century, the indentured servants were treated pretty poorly. The difference between an indentured servant and a slave is that they oftentimes paid for their passage over from Europe with 7 years or a term of service to whoever paid for their passage. There are times in the 17th century where you see indentured servants and slaves, getting together, regardless of race, having interracial families, and also fighting against the master. So the indentured servants had a lot more in common with the slaves, regardless of the skin color, than they did with the people who, owned their bond. But you see a shift in even though indentured servants existed throughout the 17th century and 18th century, you see a shift in the amount of blacks that were indentured servants in, say, 1640 compared to, 1700. So the idea of slavery became, chattel slavery became more of the norm with blacks. Tom?
Yes, Mr. Greene. I know you're going to be speaking on a few other topics. I just wonder if you could just let us know, because I know you're going to speak on the Underground Railroad and a few other things. I saw it in the newspaper. I forgot the date. Maybe you just let us know when it's going to be.
On BronxNet, channel 67, 68, 69, here on local cable, we're doing a group of segments that will air on Wednesday mornings at 10 a.m. and also rebroadcasted at 10 p.m. Highlighting different African American sites in the Bronx. So they will air on BronxNet. We did a segment on Matthew Henson last week. It was with Robert Perry as supposedly the first people to reach the North Pole. So I went down to the Explorers Club and had a chance to meet with their curator. We got it all on camera. I actually touched his glove that he was wearing when he made it to the North Pole, which was, as a history guy, that was made for me.
Excuse me, I have two statements. You look back into the Old Testament, which is Christian, Judeo. In any case, you had slavery all the way going all the way back from that period of time. Also, people buried within their backyard, so to speak, because they did not have cars, or maybe they were lucky they had horses and the like. So I'm talking from a common sense perspective. Also, you had a flash there in reference to the Catholic clergy, and I don't think you didn't touch upon it. Because the Catholic clergy worked very, very hard, sisters and the priests inclusive, and helping repair whatever harm that was done to all people, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I do think, I am of the Catholic faith, I think this should be touched upon, and verified.
Well,
Okay?
and that's a
So
good.
you did not, from what, granted I came in late, but I'm just talking about your general overall speech. I mean, I am not a Bronx, I did not live in the Bronx until I married, I don't know what your background is. I lived in the various other boroughs myself, so this is the reason I'm
There was, and if you read Priscilla Otan, the borough historian, you read a lot of the work that's been done about the Bronx. During the Civil Rights Movement, it was, as you see here, this is a flyer to go down to protest the bombing of the 16th Street Church where the 4 young girls died. It was a multi-religious effort. It wasn't as if you had rampant segregation here in the Bronx and people were going by and letting it happen. For the most part, and again, if you read Professor Otan's work, you see that the Bronx was extremely accepting of people. I hope I didn't say that, the Catholic Church was.
No, it's just that I saw this and you didn't touch upon it. I was brought up in the Lower East, I was born in Brooklyn, brought up in the Lower East Side, I lived in Brooklyn, and then, like I said, I got married, I came to the Bronx, so my perspective is probably different than yours. I don't know you were brought up and so forth and so, but I do think the Catholic Church should be acknowledged.
True.
I just want to add that I know a lot of black slaves were brought in from the island, and they were already Christianized, and many were Catholics, as it turns out. They were brought in to teach a lot of the slave owners French, because many spoke French, and many were Catholic religion. I know there was one slave from Van Cortlandt, from the Van Cortlandt estate, who was a runaway, and I guess it was like about 1750s, and they even mentioned that he was a Catholic, and by name.
In the front?
I just would like to comment that people of African ancestry that were brought here, the traditions and religions of the West was imposed upon them.
Talk about it.
It wasn't something that they did freely.
Talk about it.
So I think it's very important that you realize that their own systems of worship was not encouraged. And many times they were actually murdered if they tried to practice their indigenous faith. So I don't know if it's such a great thing. Now, we're Catholic, we're Baptist, we're this, we're that, but it wasn't of our free will initially. So I think that point needs to be understood.
I just meant that the Catholic
But I was responding to him. I wasn't responding to you, I was responding to him about him saying that Africans became Catholic, what I was trying to
I agree with you.
understand. It was forced upon them. And also, many, within the last 10 years, the Pope has even apologized for the role that the Catholic Church played in the slave trade. They actually used to bless the vessels that went into Africa to bring human beings as cargo. So I think we need to remember this. That's all I have to say.
Good point. Right here, sir?
Yeah, you mentioned about the first Bronx inhabitants were from like Dutch, German, place of Jews, I think, and they were replaced by people from the Caribbean and other islands.
In the 20th century.
Right, in the 20th century. And you also mentioned something about following that, there was some elected officials or something like that that you mentioned. Were those also people of color?
Yes, Walter Gladwin, Ivan Warner, and Wendell Foster were all elected officials in the Bronx.
Okay, they were from the islands?
I don't know the background.
Did the people from the islands make up the majority of the blacks in the Bronx at that time?
That I don't know. I had to look deeper at the census data.
I wanted to say, I was raised up in the Bronx. I was born in the Bronx in the 1960s, okay? And so I'm a Bronx resident. I know about the Bronx. I was raised up in the South Bronx, and I have to tell you, there were some racial riots in the Bronx, because I went to Vander Childs High School, and they used to have fights there all the time because of between whites, the Latinos, and the blacks at that time that were going to Vander Childs. There was actually some tension going on between whites at that time. You know, I'm talking about young people and of school age and some blacks. So that school that you showed, Morris, I mean, that could have been because they only had maybe 2 African Americans in the whole school. But when you look at other schools that they really had, were going into really white areas at that time, because when I went to school, that was a really kind of big white area that up by Vander Childs, what would that be, like Gun Hill Road area up there? It was a majority whites, and the majority of people going to that school were whites. And so when Latinos and blacks were going there, we were actually having some problems going there.
And it wasn't just that particular school. Lehman High School had riots. My cousin was one of the first African Americans, I guess, for lack of a better word, to be bused in Lehman. And they were chased down parts of the avenue with baseball bats in the early 70s. Lehman High School was a hotbed of tension with the first African American students, and Latinos began to attend that school. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, and a lot of these things that you folks are saying, the Bronx African American History Project is collecting oral histories, and that's what some of the things that are starting to come out, because for whatever reason, you know, scholars missed it and looking at newspaper articles, whatever, but these stories are, or it omitted it, right, and that's how these stories are coming to life. And to close up, just the discussion we're having here today, you know, it shows that things are getting better and things are progressing, but we still need to have a national conversation about race and what happened in the 60s and how that relates to today, and try to construct some sort of plan to move forward and really find an optimum level of equilibrium, whatever that is. But yes.
We briefly discussed that there were burial grounds where people died from ancestors who had been enslaved were buried. Was there any research to dig up some of these grave sites, to do research to see the ages of the people, and all kind of data that entails?
Yeah, there are no projects that I know of that are underway to do that. Not to say that there isn't any, but I don't know.
How would you know? Are there is there anything there that would indicate that this is a burial site?
Atlas maps, the old real estate atlases, we have a number of them at the Historical Society, will show what was on the site, and it'll say, you know, building, it'll describe the type of building material, and sometimes what was on that site. As Tom Casey said, there are a number of cemeteries that we know of, just because those families were, you know, had some money, and you know, the Dre family is a famous family, as are Van Cortland's. But a lot of the old, sometimes unmarked graves, you know, we just don't know. Sometimes they were built over top of, as what happened in Lower Manhattan, and some of them might be lost, and some of them might be, you know, still out there waiting for us to discover them. So, right, that's what.
The site of the Jerome Park race center, is that the current reservoir site? Is that what that is?
That whole area, yeah, that general area, and a little bit further east. All right, well, thank you for attending.